Hi and welcome back to Police Stories Podcast. This is episode 33, a series of short stories, mostly short, about my 28-year career in the UK police force. So last week, lots of downloads from the last couple of episodes. I thought it might be quite interesting to people. Shots fired is something that perhaps in the US certainly is not that rare, but in the UK it's still quite a big deal. Hopefully you found that interesting. So this week we're going to talk about a little bit of the aftermath of that, although we're almost ready to move on, and then on to another couple of jobs. So immediately after that, I think I said that I had some time off where I went to, like a welfare property that the force had at the time, and just had a little bit of time off to make sure I was okay. My firearms permit, which is like your license to carry a firearm, issued, through the police. That wasn't taken off me. Generally it is if there's a concern or if something major has happened, but at the time they said, well, as far as we're concerned, we don't think you've done anything wrong, so we're not going to take it off you. Although I did actually voluntarily hand it in and say, realistically, I'm not going to carry for a little bit of time anyway, so have it back for now. Directly afterwards, the force has to refer itself to what's called the IOPC, or I think they're IOPCC now, but basically the Independent Police Complaints, and they look at every police shooting in the UK. Like I say, thankfully a fairly rare occurrence, but it's a way of really the force, keeping itself right and making sure that everything that should have been done was, and that the procedures were correct. And a chance for, the complaints to make sure there's sort of nothing to answer. Can be a worrying time for cops. I say a lot of people would never, ever consider being armed for just that reason. They just don't want to go through the sort of the nightmare that it can be. But in my scenario, it was relatively straightforward. And in fact, I was picked up by a detective superintendent that's quite a high rank in the UK police force, and he worked for the IOPC. Really nice guy. No sort of prejudgments. He wasn't funny with me. He picked me up in his private car and we went off for a drive basically and drove back to the scene where my shooting had been. And he said, I've read the report, I've read your statement, I'm pretty happy what's happened. Don't forget there was another sort of 4 police witnesses there, so there was quite a clear picture, and the helicopter up as well, so a really good picture of what had happened at the shooting. And they turned the electric off to the train line again, and basically we went down and had a walk on the train line, and just, I talked him through where I'd stood and what I'd said and what had happened and what have you. It took a few more weeks, but ultimately the report came back as IOPC were also happy with the shooting. There was no issues from their point of view. So I was obviously offered the opportunity to go back to work, which I wanted to do. I wanted to, sort of crack on and move on, really. Didn't want to dwell on anything too much. But bearing in mind that, in the force at that time, this was so rare, that, it wasn't necessarily laid out kind of what to do with someone after a shooting. And so they kind of asked me, what do you want to do? If you're coming back to ARVs, armed response vehicles, what do you want to do? And I suggested a good few screen shoots. Now, these are something that are used to test judgment. It's not about speed of quick draw McGraw, you're not a cowboy. It's about decision making and putting yourself under pressure, a sort of shoot or no shoot. It's basically a video that plays, on a screen in front of you. You have a weapon that might fire a laser or possibly paint rounds, generally I think a laser. And then you see a series of different scenarios played in front of you. So for example, it might be, a burglar backing out of a house carrying, this shows you how old he is, a video recorder or something that he's stolen from within the house. He backs out from the house and, you have to react to him. And likewise, he then does something. And there's, different endings as well. They could play it several times and different things happen. One time, he just drops the video and puts his hands up and does what he's told. The next time he drops a video and very quickly in a sort of gun-like fashion draws a remote control and points it at you, and this is the sort of thing that the screen shoots do. They test lots of different scenarios. And really for me, it was to make sure that I didn't immediately shoot everyone, and likewise that when it was clearly necessary, when the person had a gun and was pointed at me, I did take that shot. It wasn't that I'd been affected too badly by, the sort of real thing. I mean, it's a really valuable tool, and to be honest with you, I think jurors should go through it in court cases, because it's very easy to sit there and hear, you know, a defence or a prosecution tell you about these things and explain about split-second decisions, and it's dark and you run, so you're puffing and panting and all that. But the reality is, if you put a jury through some screen shoots so that they could test their ability of making snap decisions, you know, in those very, very difficult scenarios, it might, you know, open their eyes a little bit to what, you know, they're actually looking at you for. But yeah, a really good thing. So the other thing I did was just loads and loads of firearms drills, not just sort of taking the weapon apart and cleaning it and all that kind of thing. It was much more about repeated stressful shoots in terms of mag changes and stoppages on your weapon and all these sorts of things, you know, lots of tests of my abilities, really, because I just wanted to make sure that, you know, I was still up to it. You know, the last thing I wanted to do was go back and be standing beside a colleague if I just didn't think I could do my job anymore. So needless to say, I got a clean bill of health after that, and I was back to work. So that was good, you know, and to be honest with you, I pretty much put it behind me. You know, it didn't affect me afterwards, not because I'm big and clever. It just didn't, for whatever reason. I think because in my own mind, I was so happy with the decision I'd made. I don't know if happy is the right word, but so, you know, sort of content that the decision I'd made was the right one, and something that I would do again if I had to, you know. So yeah, I just moved on. So a little while later, the team, there was some information came in. We're back now on sort of, you know, armed response jobs. And there was some information. In fact, there was a series of armed robberies that had taken place at some off licenses, you know, selling alcohol and, you know, news agents selling cigarettes and papers and bits and pieces. Guy had come in with what looked like a sawn-off shotgun, although it was described several times as kind of bigger than a sawn-off shotgun, and it wasn't really clear what they meant from that, but certainly some sort of a gun. Mr. Robber comes in, points the weapon at the staff member at the till, makes them open the till, and then basically takes the cash, you know, out of the till and runs off. So by the time it came to us, it took a few days to kind of go through the various channels and get round to us while they were doing some initial inquiries. By the time it came to the sort of armed team to have a look at it, he'd been really active really quickly. I mean, quite often, you know, you can have a robbery and it happens like once every 6 months, you know, once every 3 months, something like that. But this guy had done, I think it was something like 4 already in a very short space of time, about 2 weeks. And he'd never got away with much. He was just unlucky. They just sort of cashed up or put it in the safe. He wasn't taking staff members into the back room, you know, making them open safes and all that. He was literally taking what was in the till. So each time he was literally getting away with, like, you know, a couple of £100 or something. So it really wasn't a lot, particularly when you know, realise the sentence you're going to get for that. You know, it's almost as serious as it gets. You know, an armed robbery with a firearm is a big deal. So eventually a plan was put together. And, you know, we looked at the town as a whole, and there was maybe, I don't know, a dozen targets, something like that. And when I say targets, I mean possible places he might rob in that town. He'd been sticking to this one town. Now, he'd already done sort of 4 of them. And we realised that with the resources we had, even splitting the team across, say, 2 different venues at once, we could basically just hedge our bets and pick 2 premises to cover, which would leave about another 4 that were not, you know, didn't have armed cover, and we just have to react, and we would just have to hope that we got lucky. You know, now we had sort of uniform patrols out around, and we're waiting, you know, for something to happen, basically. Of course, sure enough, on the first night when we were sat up, he did another armed robbery, and of course it wasn't at either of the 2 locations we were covering. So there was a very quick, you know, sort of makeover to the place that had been robbed. Again, no sort of weapon discharge, just point the weapon, steal what was in the till and off. No trace of him. You know, he was completely hooded and masked up, so there was no sort of description or anything. And all we had really from that night where he'd done the robbery, that you know, we hadn't caught him, unfortunately. Even though we were there very quickly, it was an absolute maze around the shop, lots of alleyways and places he could have gone, so really difficult to sort of get hold of him. But one of the sergeants off the team had seen a guy relatively nearby shortly after. I say shortly after, a little while after the robbery, maybe 15 minutes or something. By that time, you'd expect someone to be well away from the area, unless, of course, he lived close. Anyway, he stop-checked this guy, And the guy was, you know, seemingly innocent, had nothing on him. He got searched. You know, there's nothing on him. There's no weapon, no cash, nothing at all to link him to the robbery. But what he did do was just obtain his details, you know, made note of his name, filled out a quick sort of search form to say he'd been searched, and that was that. Thought nothing more of it. So sure enough, the following night we were back again, and sat up. The team was sat up again, waiting for you know, him to strike. Obviously, we picked a different 2 targets this night, slightly closer to the first one, because now we were really thinking perhaps he hasn't got transport, perhaps he hasn't got a vehicle, so he is literally doing the, you know, the targets that are closest to him so he can get to him on foot. So we were sat up again in the cars waiting for something to happen, and sure enough, another robbery came in, although once again not at either of the 2 premises we were covering, but it was closer to one of the teams. So this same sergeant and some others kind of went rushing to that scene, and lo and behold, very near now to this place was this guy that he'd stopped before. So he stopped him again, realised it was the same guy, and on a little bit of a whim, but, you know, good policing ultimately, he arrested the guy because, you know, he said, you know, that's 2 robberies in 2 days and you've been near on both of them. He did fit the description in terms of size and build. And don't forget that in the UK, we arrest on suspicion of the offence. So we're not saying they've done it, but there's certainly evidence to suggest they might have. And therefore, we will arrest them, and then ultimately we can go away and try and see if there is a case to answer by interviews and speaking to witnesses and CCTV, etc. So they took him into custody, and they went back and developed it a bit, did some follow-up inquiries, and ended up going round to his house, actually speaking to his family. From what I remember, he was quite young, and when they spoke to the family, they didn't know what it was about initially, and seemed like a decent family, decent background he came from. But they had said that he'd found a weapon in his granddad's loft. Now, his granddad, I think, was in the Navy during the Second World War, and at some point during that, he got hold of a very, very rare and specialist, it was a U-boat flare gun, I think, and it was described to the officers that went round as a very large sort of double-barreled sawn-off shotgun, you know, where the barrels were, you know, much bigger than a normal shotgun because it fired flares, basically. They said, oh, yeah, he found this, you know, in Grandad's loft. And we'd seen him kind of looking at it and playing around with it. So, of course, they were invited to go up to his bedroom to have a look, which the cops did. And, of course, they found the weapon. And it was very, very distinctive. You know, they took photos of it. It was shown to the various places that had been robbed, and they confirmed that was definitely it. And then there was a load more follow-up work done. You know, it was 100% him. There was absolutely no doubt. And, of course, the slightly ironic ending is that he got a very lengthy prison sentence for, I think in the end it was like 6 armed robberies. But his total amount of money he got away with it wasn't much at all. It was literally a couple of £100 each time. So I think he ended up walking away with about 3 or 4 grand. Now, ultimately, this weapon that he'd used was sold off by the family. Grandad was long since died. So it was sold off at auction by the family. And it was so rare, it made £6,000 at auction, considerably more than he'd got. So, yeah, a little bit of irony there that the weapon, had he just sold the weapon and not done any robberies, he'd have been, you know, 2 grand up. But instead he had, yeah, a fairly lengthy prison sentence. So that was quite an interesting one. And then another one that came in, and it was a classic. We've talked about MASS before, which is Mobile Arms Support to Surveillance. So a surveillance team gets put on someone, and in this scenario, that's exactly what happened. There was basic information that this guy was going to rob a bank. Bit old school, bit classic, I know, you know, but it used to happen. And he supposedly had a contact that had a firearm. He'd got hold of this firearm, or was going to get hold of the firearm, and then he was intending to rob a bank. Of course, like usual, we didn't know which bank, you know, which friend he was getting the weapon off, what time, you know, what day. You know, we didn't have an awful lot, apart from the fact, you know, the information was he was going to rob a bank. So we put a full surveillance team on him, and they did a lot of what we call lifestyle surveillance. So we're trying to establish, you know, what are his movements, who are his friends, where does he live, what pub does he drink in, what gym does he work out in, you know, what betting shop does he go to, whatever it is. We basically, over a period of a week, we need to know and want to know everything about that person, because then if there's something out of the ordinary, something a little bit different, that can give us the heads up. Now, of course, the problem with doing that surveillance with the information you have is that there's a very real risk he may already have the weapon, and that he suddenly decides, that's it, I'm off to do the robbery. You know, he's not going to broadcast it to anyone, or it's unlikely. So what you have to have, as well as the surveillance team who weren't armed, you have to have a couple of armed cars at the back of the convoy and able to move up the convoy and, you know, and deal with an armed threat should it suddenly look like he's going to head for a bank. But very, very difficult to achieve the timing, you know, in terms of you need to keep the team and the armed team, the surveillance, close enough to deal with stuff, but not so close that you spook him. So in the end, they narrowed the information down, and they actually caught him over the series of a week going to recce a particular bank. Well, that's certainly what it appeared to the team. He went to the same town for a few days in a row, and every day he went to this specific bank and kind of looked through the windows and looked outside. I think he even went in 1 or 2 times, which got the team really nervous, but they were pretty confident he didn't have the weapon on him. You know, he had no bag with him. I think it was the summer, so he had, like, you know, shorts and a t-shirt on, so there wasn't many places to hide a weapon. Now, they had the team in very close should something happen, but we'd have definitely been, you know, on the back foot at that point. So he was followed about, and yeah, they were pretty confident that we had the target. We knew what the target was. Of course, we still didn't know the day, but you know, again, we had to hedge our bets. We had to put people into the bank, and what happened was, on the morning that he was being looked at again under surveillance, he was acting very differently. He had different clothes on. Bear in mind, it was hot. He had, like, you know, a big jacket on. I think he had, like, you know, a classic sort of rolled up woolly hat, which was probably a balaclava, although we didn't know that. Big bulky clothing. And then I think he went to a garage or a lockup and he picked up a small bag, you know, which the surveillance team were pretty sure, in terms of the way he carried it and the way the bag was folded around it, was a handgun of some description. So the feeling very much was that, you know, today was the day. So the team followed down. Now, we had people in the bank. We had people acting as tellers, or I think they were, like, you know, trainee tellers behind the bank counter, who were armed. And the only person that was in on this was the bank manager. The rest of the staff didn't know. We had, now sometimes you have to come up with things, you know, a little bit unusual to make it work. We've talked about the sort of the moody courier who knocks on the door and asks for Mr. Joe Bloggs, and when he opens the door, that's the team springing out and running in. You know, they had to think a little bit laterally on this one as well, because we needed people in the bank, but you can't have loads of big burly cops stood around waiting, because, you know, you're going to scare him off. So what they actually did was put one of the team in a wheelchair and put them into the bank, and they had the classic, you know, kind of tartan blanket across their lap, but underneath that blanket they had an MP5 folding stock, so it was quite small, tucked away. And they also had, you know, a carer or a helper with them who was also armed. And they went and sat across, you know, in the corner of the bank, like they were waiting on the chairs to see, you know, the manager about a loan application or something like that. So you had 2 armed on the sort of, you know, in the public area, if you like. You also had a teller that was one of ours that was also armed, and they waited. So the team was sat up. We had, you know, various people dotted around all over the place, ready to deal with this guy. And you're listening to the surveillance, you're listening to the commentary of this person coming closer, and also the silver commander, who's the one that will call it in the end, or potentially the team leader. They're the ones that have the decision to make when to call it, when to call the strike, you know. And we would call it a strike. You know, there's various things on the radio. You would always get the command stand by twice first, and then you would get 3 strikes: strike, strike, strike. And to be clear, we went on the first of strike, because there's the comedy moment, of course, where somebody goes on the first strike, somebody goes on the second strike, and the last couple of members of the team, you know, react to the third one. It goes out 3 times, because if the radio's cut out the last second, chances are you're going to hear the word strike, which is enough. But in an ideal world, as soon as those first sort of 3 letters come out, of the first strike, and you've had your standby, so you are ready, that's when you go. That's when the team goes. So that's, you know, there's no doubt about it. That is quite an exciting time when you're waiting for this and you're hearing the build-up. So the team was listening to the commentary. and they could hear the guy. And the surveillance team was saying that's him toward the bank. You know, he's into the town, he's parked his car, he's on the outskirts of the town, and they knew it was only a couple of minutes to walk in. Now, the other big decision to make about when you call that strike is, if you call it too early, if they've not gone into the bank, then probably the best you can hope for is you're going to get a charge of, you know, possession of a firearm maybe, which is a much lower offence than the armed robbery he was about to carry out. However, if you let him get in the bank and actually carry out the robbery, yes, you've got the offence, you know, complete, and it's a good offence, and he's going to get, you know, a really decent sentence for that. But you're putting members of the public at risk. You know, what if he shoots one of them? You know, and can you imagine if that came out in court that, oh, we had a full armed team sat outside, and you know, of course the solicitors would have a field day. They'd be like, the armed police stood around and did absolutely nothing. You know, it's all about this timing. The other thing is that if you let him get in and now he's holding the bank up, for want of a better phrase, you know, he's got the gun in his hand and he's pointing it at members of the public or the teller or whatever. If the team then bursts in, you could very easily make him, you know, sort of take shots, or you could have a hostage situation, you know, where now he, you know, sort of grabs someone by the throat and puts a gun to their head. You know, all these things we don't want. So a really, really difficult position for a team leader or a silver commander to make that call on, you know, when to call the strike. So back to our story. Our man's close now, and he's parked his car up, and we listen to surveillance, and the surveillance says he's on foot, he's toward the target. He's on the high street, his eyes all about, he appears nervous, you know, and don't forget he's sort of dressed in the right clothing, and it's like, he's close to the bank, stand by. So everyone's on tenterhooks and literally about to sort of pull the van door open or whatever and go piling out. And he just walks straight past the bank door, and he doesn't go to it. He doesn't even glance in there. He just walks straight past. So everyone's, you know, catching their breath, you know, and stops for a second, and he carries on past. So thinking, that's weird. I wonder what's going on then, because it looked like he was ready. Anyway, as he walked off, a member of the surveillance team coming the other way said they could see him and hear him when they walked past, literally shoulder to shoulder with him, sort of geeing himself up, kind of trying to convince himself, you know, you come on, you can do this, next time we're going to do it. So, of course, he fed this back to the team, and they realised that chances are he lost his bottle. You know, he went up, he was about to do it, and then he lost his nerve at the last second. So he carries on up, you know, 100 yards past the bank, and he stops for a second. He aimlessly looks in a shop window, which he's clearly got no interest in at all. And then what happens? He turns around, he walks back, and he's back towards the bank now. So surveillance are back on him. We're getting the commentary. He's walking towards the bank. He's very close. He's 15 metres off the bank. His hand's up towards the handle. Stand by. And everyone's got their hand on the car door handle, ready to rip it open and jump out and leap on him. And he walked straight past. And he carried on past the bank again. And this same thing happened. So the team were pretty convinced he was going to do it for sure, but just didn't quite get the nerve anyway. What happens? Same thing again. He turns around. Anyway, this continued on, and he did it. I'm not kidding. It was like 4 or 5 times until eventually he finally got to do it. And he turned around for this last time. And I say this was like the 5th or 6th time. He walks up to the bank. It's stand by, his hands up, his hands on the handle of the door, and he pushes the door, and there's a clunk on the door, and the door doesn't open. And he kind of looks quizzically, and he's looking round, and he pushes the door again, and it doesn't open. It's locked. So he looks up, and he's basically, I think the bank closed at like 5:30 in the evening. He's gone there at kind of, you know, 5:15 or whatever, thinking he's going to do his robbery, and he's missed so many opportunities that by the time he actually puts his hand on the bank door and is intending to push it and go in and do his robbery, they've closed and they've locked the door, so he can't go in. So an absolute nightmare, or not maybe, is the team were, you know, virtually having heart attacks at this point, you know, every time he got that close, thinking he's going to do it now. And yeah, he didn't get the opportunity. So they had to make the decision in the end that they couldn't let him carry on. So the decision was made, and he was arrested just around the corner. And what they got was, you know, the handgun, which it was on him. He was arrested for possession of a handgun. But ultimately, he did get done for an attempted armed robbery, because they had a lot of evidence saying of what he was doing. They had footage of him back and forward. And the prosecution very much made the case that the only reason he didn't get to do that robbery was because the door was locked. Everything else said he intended to do it, but he did get convicted of it. So yeah, it was quite an interesting one, and he did end up getting done for it. But yeah, quite exciting times. So that was those two robberies. I will just talk briefly about one other job that happened, which was actually nothing to do with armed work. I think I've said before that ARVs, generally try to avoid at that point going to, sort of fights and violent things because of the fact you're carrying a firearm and you don't really want to get in a fight or a roll around with someone. But, if the division were short, if they had no one to go to a call, then absolutely you'd help out. And on this occasion, I was with my colleague and we were driving around in uniform in a marked armed response vehicle, and we found ourselves in a beauty spot on the south coast that is very well known. Unfortunately, it's very well known for suicides as well, because it's got some really, really high white cliffs, and people travel bizarrely from literally all over the country to commit suicide by jumping off these cliffs. So a sort of suicidal mail call at this location was not uncommon at all. And that's exactly what came in. Basically, the guy rang himself and said, I'm at this location and I'm going to kill myself, and I want officers to come. And that was kind of the gist of the call. So, of course, typically there was no one available, but we weren't far off. So I said to my pal, well, we'll go to that, we'll at least hold the fort and see if we can do anything. So we drive to this location, and we both said to ourselves, as I'd heard many times in the police, that it's a cry for help. He's called us. He isn't going to do it, because why would he ring us to tell us? So we headed off to the location, and when we turned up, he'd given us a description of himself. He said, I'm, 40 years old, I've got black beard, I'm in black jacket, black trousers. He's basically all in black with a big sort of black bushy beard. So it's quite distinctive. And we turn up at this location and we park in the car park and we look up the hill. There's like a steep hill to the top of where these cliffs were. And sure enough, about 50 metres ahead of us was this guy who fitted the description to a T. So we got out of the car and we started walking up the hill, and the guy stopped and waited till we started to move off, and then he beckoned us forward with his hand like he was waving us up the hill. And as soon as we started moving, he turned and slowly walked away up the hill himself. So of course we followed. And he was basically matching our speed, so we weren't making any ground on him, but he wasn't getting away from us either, if you like. So he carried on a little bit further up the hill, and this carried on 3 or 4 times, and every now and then he would stop, and we would kind of stop and try and speak to him or try and shout to him, because he's still a fair distance away, but he just didn't say anything to us. But every now and then he would beckon us forward with his arm, wave us forward, and as soon as we started moving again, he would turn and carry on up the hill, and sure enough, we would follow. So like I said, this carried on for about 3 or 4 times, and we were almost at the top, or he was certainly nearly at the top. We were a bit further down, when I heard a car sort of drawing up to the car park on the crunchy gravel down behind us where we just parked our car. And I turned and looked, and it was the first sort of divisional car, the sort of uniformed cops that had turned up to assist us. So I looked back up the hill and I said to my pal that I was with at the time, oh, that's the first, uniform car here. And my colleague said to me, he's gone. And I said, what do you mean gone? Gone where? And he was just looking sort of incredulous, and he said, he's gone, and I still couldn't get my head around. I was like, sorry, gone where, And he said, he's just jumped off. And, neither of us could believe it. So he's kind of rushed up the hill. And now this place does have, lots of different cliffs. And on some of these cliffs, I know for a fact that there are kind of ledges that aren't that far down, but there are some that are literally, flat wall of cliffs that just go straight down. So if you jump off, there's no coming back. And I was convinced that this was one of those, that he just sort of, walked out of our view and he was going to be on a ledge, kind of 10 feet down, asking for help. So we ran up to the top, the pair of us, and he was literally gone, and we looked down now, it's 600 foot down at this point. So we couldn't, we could see the beach, but we couldn't really make anything out. And of course, it was a full, Coast Guard call out. They brought the helicopter. they put people over on ropes. And I was speaking to the Coast Guard, and I said, there's a ledge here, and there surely neither of us could still believe it. And they went, no, absolutely not. It's a flat cliff. It just goes straight down 600 feet. And we were just, the pair of us were shocked, basically. And sure enough, they recovered him off the beach, you know, and there's no nice way of putting it, you know, smashed to pieces and very much dead. He had done it, you know. So many times after that, I went to suicidal calls, and people go, they've called us, you know, they're never going to do it. It's a cry for help, as I had prior to that job. But, you know, I never thought that anymore after that one. And it turned out, we think the reason he'd done it was he had an elderly mother who I think was ill. I think she had dementia. And he knew she was going to die, and probably in a very long, drawn-out way. And he just didn't want to face that. But equally, he didn't want to go off and commit suicide without telling anyone, because he was worried that, you know, no one would ever find him, and then he'd be a missing person for weeks or months before anyone found him, and his mum would kind of never know what had happened. And I think, thankfully, at this point, his mum had already gone so far down the kind of dementia route that she didn't actually know, you know, too much what was going on. So that was very much a blessing. And when they went round, she was in a care home, and the staff said, look, you know, she just isn't going to know what you're talking about. So that was something. But that's the only reason we think that he basically stopped and waited and made us watch, effectively, you know, him jump off to his death. So it was a sad one, and yeah, a bit of a shock for sure. But unfortunately, that's policing for you. Yeah, you never know what you're going to get. Okay, well, thanks for listening. There's 3 different incidents there, and a little bit of waffle, as usual. Hopefully it was interesting, and keep you coming back for some more. We'll be on to something else next week. Okay, take it easy. Speak soon. Bye.